Spotify and Salesforce may seem like an unlikely combo, but Spotify can provide a fun way to get into the flow of API integrations in Salesforce. Speaking of flows, they have the ability to pull data into Salesforce from external applications like Spotify. That means that you can build out integrations in your Salesforce org without writing any code. Today, we will explore how HTTP callouts and flows can retrieve data using Spotify's web API. Along the way, I will give an overview of some important integration topics. It's time to elevate your skill set. Spotify is an audio streaming service that gives users access to songs, podcasts, audiobooks, and more. I personally love using Spotify to jam to my favorite music. But did you know that Spotify has a web API that we can use for free? Spotify's web API allows us to retrieve data from Spotify's content. This API will come in handy for today's use case. We are working with Vibe Studios, which is a fictional recording studio. They are using the lead object to keep track of potential artists that may want to use the studio. They would like for us to implement a solution where they can see a list of top tracks from Spotify for each artist within Salesforce. The good news is that all of this can be achieved by using a screen flow. Let me show you how we can build out this integration without using any code. Here's the simplified process that we will follow for this integration. First, we will get the authentication credentials from Spotify. Next, we will store these credentials securely in Salesforce. Then we will build out a screen flow that makes an HTTP callout to Spotify that will return a list of top tracks. And then finally, we will give users permission to interact with Spotify. Let me start off by explaining endpoint URLs, since this topic will be discussed throughout this video. Endpoint URLs allow us to interact with external systems, like Spotify. Each endpoint has its own functionality, which can include sending and receiving data. Spotify provides many different endpoints. Some endpoints allow us to request access to Spotify. Others allow us to get artist information. Before we can interact with any of these endpoints, we need to make sure that Spotify and Salesforce can communicate with each other. The first step in that process is to create a new app in Spotify. Spotify apps provide us with the authentication credentials needed to integrate Spotify with Salesforce. These apps allow us to select the APIs we want to use for the integration. Think of this as Spotify's version of a connected app. You can create new apps within Spotify's developer dashboard. First, you'll want to specify a name and description for the app. Next, you'll be required to populate this redirect URI field. However, this field is only used when the user login is required to access user-specific information, like playlists and saved songs. Since this is just a demo and we aren't requesting user authorization from Spotify, I will just enter the URL to my Salesforce org. Finally, you need to select the Web API option, which will allow us to get a list of top tracks for the artist leads. Once the app is set up within Spotify, we can view the client credentials. These client credentials, also known as application secrets, will be used to authenticate our connection to Spotify, and we need to store these credentials in Salesforce. Authentication confirms your identity before gaining access to external systems. When setting up authentication for an integration, you want to avoid hard-coding credentials because that's a security hazard. We can use a combination of external and named credentials to securely store and manage credentials needed for API integrations. External credentials can be used to request tokens that will grant us access to Spotify's APIs. External credentials allow us to specify the authentication method needed for our integration and also securely store client credentials needed for authentication. External credentials also create an external credential principal, which can be added to permission sets to grant users access to interact with Spotify. To create an external credential, search for named credentials in Setup. From here, we can create a new external credential. Give the external credential a descriptive label. Now we have to choose an authentication protocol. Spotify uses OAuth 2.0 for authentication, so we will select OAuth 2.0 from the pick list. Next, we need to specify the authentication flow type. We generated client credentials for this integration, so we will select the client credentials with client secret flow option. Now, we need to specify the identity provider URL. If we review Spotify's documentation, we can see that Spotify uses this URL to create tokens. So we will add that URL here, and then we can save the external credential. Now we need to add in the client credentials that we received from Spotify. You can do this by configuring a principal on the external credential. Give the principal a descriptive name. Get the client credentials from Spotify. Paste the credentials into the respective fields, and then click Save. After creating the external credential, we have to link it to a named credential. Named credentials can be used to specify the endpoints that we want to call during an integration. In our named credential, we need to specify the root URL of the endpoint we want to call. That way, whenever we create callouts, we can reuse this named credential to access multiple endpoints. For example, we will use this named credential to call the endpoint that gets top tracks. But we might want to reuse this named credential later on to get a list of albums for each artist, or to get other artist information. Here is the common denominator in these endpoint URLs. We will use this as the root URL for our named credential. Next, we need to link the external credential we created to this named credential to ensure our HTTP callouts are authenticated. We need to enable this named credential for callouts and ensure that the Generate Authorization Header option is checked as well. Once the credentials are created, we need to give users the ability to request data from Spotify. To do this, create a permission set for Spotify access. Then we can update the permission set to include the external credential principal we created for Spotify. Anyone who wants to view our Spotify flow needs to be assigned to this permission set. Without this access, users will receive an error whenever our flow tries to make an HTTP callout to Spotify. Before we dive into the flow, we need to store the Spotify ID for each artist. So I have created this field to store the IDs, and I've marked this field as an external ID since it is an ID from an external system. We can easily get the ID for each artist by navigating to the desired artist on Spotify's web app and retrieving the ID from the URL. Then you simply need to add those IDs to each artist record in Salesforce. Now that you have a better understanding of how to securely store your integration credentials and how to give users access to interact with external systems, I can finally show you how the Spotify flow works. Here is the flow used for the HTTP callout. Let's take a closer look at each section of this flow. First, we need a variable that will retrieve the record information for each artist lead record in Salesforce. This is crucial for ensuring that our screen flow shows top tracks dynamically. Next, we need to check to see if there is a Spotify ID available for the artist. Reminder, the Spotify ID is stored on the artist's lead record. If the ID is not available, we should display a user-friendly error message reminding the user to populate the Spotify ID. Otherwise, we need to continue with the HTTP callout. HTTP callouts allow Spotify to interact with external systems. By the way, HTTP callouts can also be created in Apex, but we will discuss the Apex version in a future video. For now, let's take a closer look at how to create HTTP callouts for Spotify in a flow. First, you want to select the action element. At the bottom of the action options, click on Create HTTP Callout. This will open a new HTTP callout modal. This will prompt us to create a new external service, which will allow us to connect our org to Spotify's APIs. Give the external service a descriptive name and description. Then make sure that you select the name credential that we created earlier. Next, we need to create an HTTP callout action for a specific endpoint that we want to interact with from Spotify. We will call the action Get Artist Top Tracks, and we will give it a description. Next, we need to set the method. HTTP methods are the actions that you can take when interacting with an external system. These methods can be used to read, create, update, and delete data in an external system. For our example, we will be using the get method to retrieve top tracks from Spotify. So let's select the get method here. Now, we need to set the URL of the exact endpoint that we would like to access. If we review the API documentation, we can see the path that is used to get top tracks, and we can see an example of the full endpoint URL. You can see that the root URL of the Spotify endpoint was pulled in from the name credential we created earlier. Now we just need to add the exact path of the top tracks endpoint. As you can see, I have added the artist ID variable to include within the URL path. We will pass the Spotify ID from the lead record into this path variable. Next, we need to include a sample of a response that will be returned from Spotify. When we made the call out to Spotify, we are requesting for Spotify to send us top track information. Spotify responds to our request with top track data listed in JSON format. JSON organizes the response in key value pairs, which makes it easier for us to access specific pieces of information. We need to provide an example of the response Spotify will send us to properly configure the callout. Spotify provides example responses that we can use, but we can also use the callout wizard to generate responses from endpoints. For now, we are going to select the Use Example Response option. We can copy the example response from Spotify's documentation and paste it here. Click Review to see the data structure of the response returned from Spotify. All of these values will be accessible in our flow. Then click Save to close out of the callout wizard. As you can see, an action element is now available for the HTTP callout we just created. We need to give it a name and description, and then pass in the external Spotify ID from the lead record. Now that we have our HTTP callout configured, we need a way to check to see if the callout was successful or not. When we request information from Spotify and other external systems, we will receive a response code that will let us know if our request was successful or not. For example, we can check the Spotify documentation to see different types of response codes that we may receive from the request. If the request is successful, a 200 response code will be returned. If we don't receive a 200 response code, that means an error occurred during the request. So in our flow, we can use a decision element to implement some error handling. We can get the response code from our Get Top Tracks element. If the response code isn't 200, we can display an error message with the response code on the screen. Otherwise, we can move forward with the flow's execution. The response retrieved from Spotify contains a lot of track information that we don't need for this use case, so we need to extract the names of each track from the Spotify response. We can easily do this using the transform element. First, you'll want to add the information from Get Artist Top Tracks as source data. This will allow us to see all of the track information, including track names. We will store the track names inside of a text collection variable. Then we will simply map the track names to this collection variable. Then we can use a screen element to output the top tracks to the user. By the way, I did use a formula to reformat the list of track names. Now I want to test out our flow so you can see what's happening behind the scenes. If I click Debug and select an artist without a Spotify ID, you will see this custom error we defined in the flow. If I select an artist whose Spotify ID was entered wrong, we will see an error message on the screen with a response code. And if I select an artist whose Spotify ID is populated as expected, we will see the list of top tracks printed on the screen. On the side, you can see the huge response that Spotify sends back to Salesforce. And you can see where we extract the list of track names from the response. How cool is this? After activating and testing our flow, we can add it to Lightning record pages. We just have to make sure that we pass in the lead record values whenever we add the flow to the page. Once that is done, we can click into each artist and automatically see their top tracks from Spotify, as long as their Spotify ID is populated. Throughout this demonstration, you can see how frequently I had to refer to Spotify's API documentation. You'll always need to refer to an external system's documentation to successfully integrate it with Salesforce. You'll also need to make sure that you securely store any credentials needed for integrations, implement error handling, and follow other best practices. With the basics of API integrations under your belt, you have unlocked a whole new world of possibilities. So start experimenting, keep learning, and as always, go shock the world.